You're nothing but a welfare queen living off government handouts. My daughter-in-law Victoria sneered at me during my 65th birthday celebration at the community center. It's embarrassing how you parade around here pretending you belong with decent, hardworking people. My son Marcus nodded along, adding, "Mom, maybe it's time you accepted reality. You can't keep freeloading forever." I smiled calmly and replied, "You're absolutely right, Victoria. Maybe I should stop receiving those welfare checks. All $12,000 that come in every month from Meridian Oil Corporation." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence that followed my words was deafening. Every conversation in the modest community center hall came to an abrupt halt. The birthday decorations my neighbor Helen had so thoughtfully hung seemed to sway in the sudden tension that filled the room. Victoria's perfectly glossed lips parted in shock, her manicured fingers clutching her designer purse as if it might anchor her to reality. Marcus looked like someone had just told him the earth was flat, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and at 65 years old, I had just revealed a secret I'd been keeping for nearly 4 decades. The woman everyone in Millbrook assumed was barely scraping by on government assistance had just casually mentioned receiving more money each month than most people earned in a year. The irony wasn't lost on me that my own family had been the most vocal critics of my supposed financial dependence on the state. I had moved to Millbrook 15 years ago after my husband Samuel passed away, choosing this small Texas town specifically because nobody knew my history. The modest 2-bedroom house I rented on Maple Street was clean and comfortable, but hardly impressive. I drove a 12-year-old Toyota Camry with a dent in the passenger door and shopped for groceries with clip coupons like so many others in town. To everyone who knew me, Eleanor Whitmore was a widow living on Social Security and whatever assistance program she could qualify for. The truth was infinitely more complicated. Those monthly checks Victoria had just ridiculed weren't from any government agency. They were dividend payments from Meridian Oil Corporation, a company I had owned shares in since 1985 when I was a young woman with a head for numbers and an inheritance from my grandmother that most people would have considered modest. While my friends were buying new cars and taking vacations, I had quietly purchased stock in a small oil exploration company that most investors overlooked. 40 years later, that small investment had grown into something extraordinary. Meridian Oil had discovered 3 major fields in North Dakota and Wyoming, and my original 1,000 shares had split and multiplied until I owned a significant portion of one of the most profitable independent oil companies in the United States. The monthly dividend checks I received were enough to buy a mansion, but I preferred my quiet life in my rented house, letting everyone assume what they wanted about my circumstances. Victoria had been assuming the worst about me since the day Marcus brought him home 3 years ago. She was 32, 15 years younger than my son, and came from what she considered old money in Dallas. Her father owned a chain of furniture stores across East Texas, and her mother had made it clear from their first meeting that they considered Marcus to be marrying beneath his potential. When they discovered his mother was apparently living in poverty, their disdain became barely concealed contempt. The birthday party had been Helen's idea. My neighbor was one of the few genuine friends I had made in Millbrook, a retired school teacher who lived alone in the house next to mine. She had organized the modest celebration at the community center, inviting the handful of people I had grown close to over the years. There was Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church where I attended services, Mrs. Chen, who ran the corner market where I bought my weekly groceries, and a few other neighbors who had become part of my quiet social circle. I hadn't expected Marcus and Victoria to attend. They lived in Austin now, in a condominium that Victoria's parents had helped them purchase, and they rarely made the 2-hour drive to visit me. When they arrived at the party carrying an expensive bottle of wine and wearing clothes that cost more than some people's monthly rent, I should have known trouble was brewing. The confrontation had started innocuously enough. Victoria was making small talk with Helen, asking polite questions about the town and the community center. But I could see the judgment in her eyes as she took in the modest decorations, the folding chairs, the sheet cake from the grocery store bakery. Everything about the setting confirmed her beliefs about my circumstances and, by extension, Marcus's background. The conversation turned dangerous when Mrs. Chen mentioned that she had seen me at the post office that morning picking up mail from my box. Victoria's interest sharpened immediately. She had always been curious about my finances, asking pointed questions about how I managed to pay my bills, whether I needed help with expenses, and making subtle offers of assistance that felt more like interrogations than genuine concern. "It must be difficult," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "managing on such a limited income. I know Social Security doesn't provide much, and with the cost of everything going up," she let the sentence hang in the air, fishing for information. I had deflected, as I always did, mentioning that I managed just fine and that my needs were simple. But Victoria pressed harder, perhaps emboldened by having an audience of people she assumed were also struggling financially. That's when she made the comment that changed everything, accusing me of being a welfare queen and expressing her embarrassment at my supposed dependence on government handouts. The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because it revealed how little my son's wife thought of me. In her mind, I was a burden, an embarrassment, someone whose very existence reflected poorly on the family she was trying to build. The fact that my own son had nodded in agreement with her assessment was the final straw. Standing there in that community center hall, surrounded by people who had accepted me exactly as I appeared to be, I made a decision that would change everything. The secret I had guarded so carefully for 15 years was about to come out, and with it, the comfortable life I had built in Millbrook would never be the same. Victoria's shock was genuine and complete. Her face had gone pale beneath her expertly applied makeup, and she kept opening and closing her mouth like a fish gasping for air.
Marcus looked equally stunned, but there was something else in his expression that I recognized from his childhood. It was the same look he got when he realized he had misjudged a situation badly and was about to face consequences he hadn't anticipated. $12,000? Victoria repeated slowly, as if saying the words might make them make sense. Every month? I nodded calmly, reaching into my purse for my phone. With a few taps, I opened my banking app and turned the screen toward her. The current balance in my checking account was clearly visible, along with the deposit history showing the regular monthly payments from Meridian Oil Corporation. The numbers were undeniable, stark black digits that told a story very different from the one Victoria had been telling herself. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. The evidence was right there in front of her, displayed on a screen that couldn't lie or be misinterpreted. Pastor Williams had stepped closer, his kind eyes filled with curiosity rather than judgment. He was a good man who had never made me feel ashamed of what he assumed were my modest circumstances. "Eleanor," he said gently, "I think there might be some confusion here." I turned to address the small group that had gathered around us, feeling a strange sense of liberation as I prepared to tell the truth for the first time in 15 years. "There's no confusion, Pastor. I've been receiving dividend payments from Meridian Oil Corporation since I moved to Millbrook. I own approximately 47,000 shares of stock that I purchased over several decades, starting when the company was much smaller and the stock was considerably less expensive." The numbers meant nothing to most of the people listening, but I could see Victoria's face growing paler as she processed the implications. She might not know the exact value of Meridian Oil stock, but she clearly understood that 47,000 shares of any major corporation represented serious money. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "Mom, what are you talking about? You live in a rental house. You clip coupons. You shop at thrift stores." "I do all of those things," I confirmed, "but not because I have to, because I choose to. There's a difference between being poor and living simply." Helen was staring at me with amazement rather than anger or hurt. "Eleanor, why didn't you ever say anything? All these years when we've been worrying about whether you had enough money for groceries, for utilities?" I felt a pang of guilt at the concern I had caused my friend. I wanted to be accepted for who I am, not what I have. I've seen how money changes relationships, how people start seeing you differently when they know you're wealthy. I preferred being just Eleanor, the quiet widow who kept to herself. Victoria had been unusually silent during this exchange, but I could see her mind working furiously behind her shocked expression. She was recalculating everything she thought she knew about me, about Marcus's family background, about the narrative she had constructed around our relationships. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight with something that might have been anger or embarrassment. "You let us think you were poor," she said accusingly. "You let us feel sorry for you, offer to help you, worry about your future. Why would you do that?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and I could feel the weight of everyone's attention as they waited for my answer. The truth was complicated, layered with decades of experiences and choices that had shaped how I viewed money and relationships. But looking at Victoria's face, seeing the mixture of shock and indignation there, I realized that the simple answer was probably the most honest one. Because I wanted to know who you really were. I wanted to see how you would treat someone you thought had nothing to offer you. And now I know. Marcus stepped forward, his face flushed with confusion and what might have been shame. "Mom, that's not fair. We were trying to be helpful, trying to show concern for your welfare." "Were you?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or were you trying to manage what you saw as a problem, an embarrassing relative who reflected poorly on your new wife's social status?" The accuracy of my assessment was written across both their faces. Victoria had the grace to look ashamed, but Marcus's expression hardened with defensive anger. It was the look I remembered from his teenage years, when he had been caught in some misbehavior and was trying to shift blame rather than accept responsibility. "That's not true," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "We cared about you. We wanted to make sure you were okay."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I pulled out my phone again, this time scrolling to a different app. "Marcus, do you remember the conversation we had 6 months ago when you suggested I apply for food stamps? You said it wasn't charity, that I had earned the right to government assistance." His face went red. "I was trying to help." "And 3 months ago, when Victoria suggested I might be more comfortable in a senior living facility, one with income-based housing assistance?" Victoria's mouth opened in protest, but no words came out. The suggestion had been made during a phone conversation, delivered with the kind of gentle condescension reserved for elderly relatives who could no longer manage their own affairs. "I remember every conversation," I continued, "every suggestion, every look of pity or embarrassment. I know exactly what you both think of me, and more importantly, I know how you treat people you believe are beneath you socially and financially." The community center had grown completely quiet around us. Our small drama was playing out in front of an audience of neighbors and friends who were seeing a side of me they had never suspected existed. I could feel their eyes on us, watching this family conflict unfold with the fascination people reserve for car accidents and other disasters. Mrs. Chem spoke up from the edge of our group, her accented English careful and clear. "Eleanor always pay cash for groceries, never use food stamps, never ask for discount. I wonder sometimes how she manage, but she never complain, never ask for help." Pastor Williams nodded thoughtfully. She's been one of our most consistent contributors to the church's charity fund. Never missed a month in 15 years. I always assumed she was giving what little she could spare." I smiled at him gratefully. "I've been giving what I thought was appropriate, Pastor. Perhaps it's time I reconsidered that amount." Victoria seemed to be struggling with the new reality, her worldview shifting in real time as she processed information that contradicted everything she had believed. "But why live like this?" She gestured around the modest community center, at my simple dress and practical shoes. "If you have money, real money, why live in a rental house and drive an old car?" It was a fair question, one that went to the heart of choices I had made decades earlier. The answer required explaining a philosophy of life that Victoria, with her designer clothes and expensive tastes, might never understand. "Because things don't make you happy," I said simply. "Security does. Knowing that you have enough, that you'll always have enough, that you can help others when they need it. That's what money should provide. Not status symbols or social positioning, but freedom from worry and the ability to be generous." Marcus shook his head in frustration. "But Mom, you could have been living so much better. You could have traveled, bought a nice house, enjoyed your retirement." "I am enjoying my retirement every day. I have good friends, a peaceful life, and the satisfaction of knowing that people care about me for who I am, not what I can give them." The pointed nature of that comment wasn't lost on either Marcus or Victoria. They had both spent the past 3 years treating me like a charity case, making it clear that they saw me as a burden rather than a valued family member. The discovery that I was actually wealthy enough to buy and sell Victoria's family business several times over was clearly causing them to reevaluate everything. Helen stepped closer to me, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "Eleanor, I want you to know that none of this changes anything for me. You're still the same kind neighbor who brings me soup when I'm sick and helps me with my garden. Money doesn't change that." I squeezed her hand back gratefully. "Thank you, Helen. That means more to me than you know." But even as I appreciated Helen's loyalty, I could see the calculations happening behind other people's eyes. Mrs. Chen was looking at me with new interest, probably wondering if my grocery shopping habits would change now that my secret was out. Pastor William seemed to be thinking about church fundraising opportunities. The other neighbors were whispering among themselves, no doubt speculating about exactly how much money I might have. This was exactly what I had feared, what I had spent 15 years trying to avoid. The moment people learned about your wealth, everything changed. Relationships became transactional. Simple interactions became complicated by unstated expectations and assumptions. The authentic connections I had built in Millbrook were about to be tested in ways I had hoped they never would be. Victoria seemed to be recovering from her initial shock, and I could see a new kind of calculation in her eyes. She was probably thinking about all the opportunities she had missed, all the financial assistance that might have been available if she had known the truth about my circumstances. The woman who had spent 3 years looking down on me as an embarrassing, poor relation was now seeing me as a potential resource. "Well," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled, "this certainly changes things, doesn't it?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, Victoria, it certainly does." Marcus looked between his wife and me, clearly sensing the tension but not quite understanding its source. "Mom, I think we need to sit down and talk about this. Privately. There's obviously been some misunderstanding about your situation." "There's been no misunderstanding on my part," I replied. "I've always known exactly what my situation was. The misunderstanding was yours." The birthday party that had started as a modest celebration among friends had turned into something entirely different. The cake sat untouched on its table while everyone processed the revelation that had just exploded their assumptions about who I was and what my place in their community should be. I looked around at the faces surrounding me, seeing curiosity, shock, embarrassment, and, in some cases, the beginning of a new kind of speculation. The quiet life I had built in Millbrook was about to become much more complicated, and I wasn't sure if that was a price I was prepared to pay for the satisfaction of finally telling the truth.
But as I watched Victoria's face cycle through various emotions, as I saw Marcus struggling to reconcile the mother he thought he knew with the woman standing before him, I realized that some truths couldn't be hidden forever. The facade I had maintained for 15 years had been shattered in a single moment of frustration and honesty. Now I would have to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. The only question was whether the relationships that survived this revelation would be stronger for having been built on truth rather than assumptions, or whether the comfortable life I had built would crumble under the weight of expectations and complications that money inevitably brought. The silence stretched on, filled with unspoken questions and uncomfortable realizations, while my 65th birthday party took on a significance none of us had anticipated when the day began. That night, I sat in my small living room on Maple Street, staring at the oil stock certificates I hadn't looked at in years. The manila folder was worn at the edges, filled with documents that told the story of 40 years of careful investing and patient wealth building. The certificates were beautiful in their own way, ornate borders surrounding the formal language that declared my ownership in Meridian Oil Corporation. But they represented so much more than just financial assets. They were the foundation of a life I had built deliberately, carefully, and in complete secrecy. The story began in 1984 when I was 25 years old and working as a bookkeeper for Morrison Agricultural Supply in Tyler, Texas. Samuel and I had been married for 3 years, and we were struggling like most young couples in the 80s economy. He worked construction during the day and took night classes at the community college, hoping to become a certified electrician. I kept the books for Mr. Morrison and took freelance accounting work in the evenings to make ends meet. My grandmother, Rose Whitmore, had passed away that spring, leaving me an inheritance that most people would have considered modest. $15,000 in 1984 money wasn't life-changing wealth, but it was more than Samuel and I had ever possessed at one time. Most of our friends would have used it for a down payment on a house or a new car. Some might have taken a vacation or paid off credit card debt. But I had always been fascinated by numbers, by the way money could grow if you understood the patterns and were patient enough to let compound interest work its magic. During my lunch breaks at Morrison Agricultural, I would read the financial newspapers that Mr. Morrison subscribed to, studying stock prices and corporate earnings reports with the same intensity that other people reserved for sports scores or celebrity gossip. That's how I first learned about Meridian Oil Corporation. It was a small, independent company based in Midland, Texas, that specialized in acquiring and developing oil properties that the major companies had overlooked or abandoned. The stock was trading at $3.25 per share, and most analysts considered it a risky investment in a volatile industry. But something about Meridian's business model appealed to me. Instead of spending millions on exploration and new drilling, they were buying proven reserves at discount prices from companies that needed quick cash. They had a small but experienced management team, minimal debt, and a strategy that seemed designed for long-term growth rather than quick profits. I spent weeks researching everything I could find about Meridian Oil. I read their annual reports, studied their acquisition history, and tried to understand the fundamentals of the oil business. Samuel thought I was crazy when I told him I wanted to invest grandmother's inheritance in stock for a company he had never heard of. "Eleanor," he said one evening as we sat at our small kitchen table, papers spread between us like battle plans, "we could put a down payment on a house with that money, start building some real equity instead of gambling on oil stocks." I understood his perspective. Samuel was a practical man who believed in tangible assets, things you could see and touch. The idea of converting $15,000 into pieces of paper that represented fractional ownership in a company hundreds of miles away seemed foolish to him. But I had a feeling about Meridian Oil that went beyond rational analysis. Call it intuition or stubbornness, but something told me that this small company was going to be much larger someday. So, in September of 1984, I bought 4,615 shares of Meridian Oil Corporation at $3.25 per share. For the first 2 years, it looked like Samuel had been right to worry. The oil industry was in the middle of a brutal downturn, with prices dropping from their early 80s highs to levels that made many operations unprofitable. Meridian's stock price fell to under $2 per share, and I watched my $15,000 investment shrink to less than $10,000.
Samuel never said anything directly, but I could see the concern in his eyes when the monthly statements arrived.
He was too kind to say, "I told you so," but the implication hung in the air whenever we discussed our finances. I began to doubt my own judgment, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake that would haunt us for years. Then, in 1987, everything changed. Meridian Oil announced that they had successfully acquired the drilling rights to a formation in North Dakota that previous owners had considered played out. Using new extraction techniques that had been developed for similar formations in other states, they were able to access oil reserves that had been previously unreachable. The first well came in producing 200 barrels per day, far exceeding expectations. The second well was even better. Within 6 months, Meridian had gone from a struggling independent to one of the most talked about success stories in the oil patch. The stock price jumped from $2 to $8 practically overnight. Suddenly, my investment was worth nearly $40,000. Samuel was amazed, and frankly, so was I. I had hoped the stock would eventually appreciate, but the speed and magnitude of the gain was beyond anything I had anticipated. Most people would have sold at that point, taking their profits and celebrating their good fortune. But I held on. Something told me that this was just the beginning for Meridian Oil. The North Dakota formation was larger than anyone had initially realized, and the company's management team was already planning additional acquisitions using the cash flow from their new wells. Over the next few years, I watched my investment continue to grow. Meridian expanded into Wyoming and Montana, always focusing on properties that other companies had given up on or overlooked. Their strategy of buying low and applying new technology to old problems proved remarkably successful. By 1990, my original investment had grown to over $100,000. Samuel and I were able to buy a small house without taking on a mortgage, and we started talking about having children. Marcus was born in 1991. And for the first time in our marriage, we had financial breathing room. The stock continued to appreciate throughout the 90s, splitting twice and paying increasingly generous dividends as Meridian's production expanded. I reinvested every dividend payment, buying additional shares whenever the company offered them to existing shareholders. What had started as a single investment was becoming a significant portfolio. Samuel understood that we were becoming wealthy, but he never fully grasped the scope of what was happening. To him, the stock certificates in our safety deposit box were abstractions, numbers on paper that didn't quite feel real. He preferred to focus on his work and his family, leaving the financial decisions to me. I didn't mind his lack of interest in our investments. If anything, it made it easier for me to continue building our position in Meridian Oil without the pressure of constant second-guessing or suggestions to diversify into other investments. Samuel trusted me to manage our money, and I took that responsibility seriously. The late 90s brought even more dramatic gains as oil prices recovered from their mid-decade lows, and Meridian Oil became recognized as one of the most efficiently run independent oil companies in the United States. By the time Marcus graduated from high school in 2009, my original $15,000 investment had grown to over $3 million. But wealth brought complications I hadn't anticipated. Friends and neighbors began to notice that we always seemed to have money for whatever we needed. We never struggled with car repairs or medical bills the way many families did. Marcus never wanted for anything, and while we weren't ostentatious about our spending, the signs of financial comfort were hard to hide completely. I started to see changes in how people related to us. Casual friendships became more complicated when friends began asking for loans or investment advice. Family gatherings grew tense when relatives made comments about our good fortune or hinted that we should be more generous with our success. The worst part was watching how it affected Marcus. As a teenager, he began to take our financial security for granted, assuming that money would always be available for whatever he wanted. He developed expensive tastes and a casual attitude towards spending that worried me deeply. I tried to teach him the value of money and the importance of working for what you wanted, but it was difficult when he knew that his college education and other expenses were already taken care of. When Samuel died suddenly of a heart attack in 2010, everything changed. Marcus was away at college, and I found myself alone in our house with more money than I knew what to do with and no one who understood how I had acquired it. The grief was overwhelming, but so was the isolation that comes with significant wealth. That's when I made the decision that would define the next 15 years of my life. I would start over somewhere new, somewhere nobody knew about the Meridian oil stock or the millions it had generated. I would become just another widow living on a modest fixed income, free to build relationships based on who I was rather than what I owned. I chose Millbrook because it was far enough from Tyler to ensure I wouldn't run into anyone who knew my history, but close enough that Marcus could visit when he wanted to. The town was small and friendly, full of retirees and working families who minded their own business and didn't ask too many personal questions. Renting the house on Maple Street instead of buying was a deliberate choice. Home ownership would have raised questions about how I could afford the down payment and monthly expenses. Renting suggested someone living on Social Security and possibly other assistance, which is exactly the impression I wanted to create. I opened a new checking account at the local bank and arranged for my Meridian Oil dividends to be deposited monthly. To anyone who saw the deposits, they looked like government payments. The amounts were large for welfare or Social Security, but not so large to attract unwanted attention from bank employees or other customers who might catch a glimpse of my statements. The rest of my assets, the stock certificates and investment accounts that held the bulk of my wealth, remained with my financial advisors in Dallas. I visited them quarterly to review my portfolio and make any necessary adjustments, but otherwise my life in Millbrook was completely separate from my identity as a wealthy investor. For 15 years, the strategy worked perfectly. I built genuine friendships with people who accepted me as Eleanor Whitmore, the quiet widow who lived simply and contributed what she could to community activities.
Helen became my closest friend, sharing garden vegetables and checking on me during ice storms without any ulterior motives. Pastor Williams appreciated my consistent but modest contributions to the church without knowing that I could have funded an entire new building without strain. Even Mrs. Chen at the corner market treated me with the same respectful attention she showed all her customers, never making me feel ashamed of using coupons or buying generic brands. In Millbrook, I was just another neighbor, and that anonymity was worth more to me than any luxury money could buy. But maintaining the facade required constant vigilance. I had to be careful about what I bought, where I went, and how I spent my time. I couldn't take expensive vacations or drive luxury cars without raising questions. I had to watch my language, avoiding casual references to financial concepts or investment strategies that might reveal my background. The hardest part was dealing with Marcus and eventually Victoria. My son had grown up with financial security, but he hadn't been privy to the details of our family's wealth. After Samuel's death, when I moved to Millbrook and adopted my new lifestyle, Marcus assumed I was struggling financially. His assumption was reasonable given the circumstances. He knew his father had worked construction, and he knew I had worked as a bookkeeper. Neither career suggested the kind of income that would leave a widow wealthy. When he saw my modest living situation in Millbrook, it confirmed his belief that I was barely getting by on Social Security and whatever small savings we might have accumulated. I could have corrected his misunderstanding at any time, but I chose not to. I wanted to see what kind of man my son would become, how he would treat a mother he believed was financially dependent. I wanted to know if the values Samuel and I had tried to teach him about respect and family loyalty would survive the test of perceived economic inequality. For several years, Marcus was wonderfully supportive. He called regularly, visited when he could, and always offered to help with expenses if I needed assistance. He never made me feel like a burden or treated me with anything less than love and respect. Then he met Victoria. Victoria came from a family that measured worth in dollars and social status. Her parents, the Sterlings, owned a successful chain of furniture stores across East Texas and had accumulated what they considered significant wealth. They lived in a large house in the best neighborhood of Marshall, belonged to the country club, and sent their daughter to private schools and exclusive summer camps. When Marcus brought Victoria home to meet me during their second year of dating, I could see immediately that she was assessing my value as a potential mother-in-law. The small house, the modest furnishings, the careful way I shopped and lived, all of it registered as disappointment in her perfectly composed features. She was polite, of course, too well-bred to be openly rude to someone she had just met, but there were subtle signs of disdain in the way she examined my living room, the questions she asked about my situation, and the sympathetic looks she gave Marcus when she thought I wasn't watching. Over the months that followed, I watched my son's attitude toward me begin to change. Victoria was skilled at planting seeds of doubt and concern without seeming manipulative or unkind.
She would make casual comments about elderly people who struggled to manage their finances, share articles about seniors who fell victim to scams, and express worry about my ability to maintain my independence as I aged. Gradually, Marcus began to see me through Victoria's eyes. Instead of his mother who had sacrificed to give him opportunities, I became an aging woman who needed management and protection. Instead of someone whose judgment he respected, I became someone whose decisions required oversight and intervention. The transformation was subtle but devastating. Marcus started making suggestions about my living arrangements, my spending habits, and my future planning. He offered to help me apply for various assistance programs, assuming I was too proud or too confused to navigate the bureaucracy myself. He began treating me like a child who needed guidance, rather than an adult who had been managing her own affairs successfully for decades. Victoria's influence extended beyond just changing Marcus's perception of me. She also began to shape his understanding of what their marriage should look like, what kind of lifestyle they deserved, and what role his family should play in their social aspirations. A mother-in-law who appeared to be living in poverty was obviously an embarrassment, someone to be managed discreetly rather than celebrated openly. The irony was exquisite. While Victoria was looking down on me for my supposed financial dependence, her parents were struggling with cash flow problems in their furniture business. While she was embarrassed by my modest lifestyle, I was receiving monthly dividend payments that exceeded her father's annual profit margins. But I kept my secrets, continuing to play the role of the struggling widow while watching my son's marriage take shape around values that prioritized wealth and status over character and family loyalty. I told myself that Marcus was young, that he would eventually see through Victoria's shallow materialism and remember the principles Samuel and I had tried to instill in him. I was wrong. If anything, Marcus embraced Victoria's worldview with the enthusiasm of someone who finally understood what he had been missing. They moved to Austin, upgraded their lifestyle dramatically, and began to distance themselves from anyone who didn't fit their new social aspirations, including me. The visits became less frequent, the phone calls shorter and more peremptory. When they did visit Millbrook, Victoria's discomfort was obvious. She would comment on how quaint everything was, how peaceful it must be to live so simply, always with the underlying suggestion that my circumstances were pitiable rather than enviable. Marcus began to echo her sentiments, expressing concern about my isolation, my limited resources, and my future security. He started bringing up topics like senior living facilities and government assistance programs, assuming I was too proud or too confused to navigate the bureaucracy myself. The suggestions became more frequent and more specific. Victoria thought I might be happier in a community with other seniors, somewhere I could make friends of people in similar circumstances. Marcus worried that I was becoming too isolated, that my independence might be dangerous as I aged. Neither of them seemed to consider that I might be perfectly content with my life as it was, that my choices were deliberate rather than desperate.
In their minds, anyone with options would choose differently, and my failure to pursue those options was evidence of confusion or denial rather than personal preference. The culminating moment came at my birthday party, when Victoria's facade finally cracked and she revealed exactly what she thought of me. The words welfare queen and government handouts weren't spoken in anger or frustration. They were spoken with the cold certainty of someone stating obvious facts. That's when I knew the charade had gone on long enough. 15 years of hiding my wealth, of allowing my own family to believe I was a burden rather than an asset, had taught me everything I needed to know about their character. The revelation that followed wasn't just about correcting their misunderstanding, it was about forcing them to confront the assumptions and prejudices that had shaped their treatment of me. Now, sitting in my modest living room with the stock certificates spread across my coffee table, I realized that my secret was out, and my quiet life in Millbrook was about to become much more complicated. The question was whether the relationships that had been built on false assumptions could survive the truth, or whether the wealth I had worked so hard to accumulate would ultimately cost me the family connections that mattered most. The monthly dividend statements showed that my Meridian oil holdings were now worth just over $14 million. The quarterly reports indicated that new discoveries in Texas and New Mexico were likely to drive even more growth in the coming years. I was, by any reasonable measure, a wealthy woman who could afford any lifestyle I chose. But sitting alone in my small rental house, surrounded by the evidence of a financial success that I couldn't share or celebrate,
I wondered if I had made the right choices. The money had given me security and independence, but it had also isolated me from the very relationships that should have been most important. Tomorrow, I would have to decide what to do with the knowledge that my son and daughter-in-law had revealed about themselves. The power that came with wealth was real, but so were the responsibilities that came with using it. The next phase of this story would determine whether money could rebuild the bridges that assumptions had burned, or whether some betrayals were too fundamental to forgive. The morning after my revelation brought an unexpected visitor. I was brewing coffee in my small kitchen when I heard the rumble of an expensive engine in my driveway. Through the window, I watched a silver Mercedes-Benz sedan come to a stop behind my aging Toyota. Richard Sterling emerged from the driver's seat, his face grim with determination and what might have been desperation. Victoria's father had never visited me before. In the 3 years since Marcus and Victoria's wedding, Richard had maintained a polite but distant relationship with me, the kind reserved for relatives you tolerate but don't particularly value. His unexpected appearance could only mean one thing. Victoria had called her parents with news of my financial revelation, and the Sterling family was now reassessing their strategy. I opened the door before he could knock, greeting him with the same calm demeanor I had maintained throughout the previous evening's confrontation. "Good morning, Richard. This is a surprise." He looked uncomfortable standing on my modest front porch, as if the very act of being there diminished his status somehow. Richard Sterling was a man accustomed to conducting business in his own office, surrounded by the expensive furniture his stores sold and the symbols of success he had accumulated over decades in retail. "Eleanor, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "May I come in?" I stepped aside to let him in, noting how his eyes swept over my small living room with new interest. Yesterday, the space would have confirmed his assumptions about my circumstances. Today, it was a puzzle that didn't quite make sense given what Victoria had surely told him about my oil dividends. "Coffee?" I offered, gesturing toward the kitchen. "No, thank you." He remained standing in the center of the room, his expensive suit and polished shoes making him look like an actor who had wandered onto the wrong set. "Eleanor, Victoria called us last night. She was quite upset about some misunderstanding regarding your financial situation." I settled into my favorite chair, a comfortable recliner I had bought secondhand when I first moved to Millbrook. "I wouldn't characterize it as a misunderstanding, Richard, more like a correction of false assumptions." His jaw tightened slightly. Richard Sterling was accustomed to controlling conversations, to setting terms and managing outcomes. Having this discussion in my modest living room, where I held all the relevant information, clearly made him uncomfortable. Victoria mentioned something about oil stocks and monthly payments. Perhaps there's been some confusion about investment accounts or inheritance matters. I almost smiled at his attempt to find an explanation that would allow everyone to maintain their existing worldview. Richard needed me to be the struggling widow he had always believed me to be, because any other reality would require him to acknowledge that his family had been wrong about fundamental assumptions. "There's no confusion, Richard. I own 47,000 shares of Meridian Oil Corporation stock, acquired over a period of 40 years through careful investing and reinvestment of dividends. The monthly payments Victoria referred to are my current dividend income, which amounts to approximately $12,000 per month." The numbers hit him like physical blows. I watched his face cycle through disbelief, calculation, and finally a kind of stunned acceptance as he processed the implications. 47,000 shares of a major oil company represented serious wealth, the kind that dwarfed his furniture chain. "That's impossible," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "You live in a rental house. You drive an old car. You clip coupons at the grocery store. I do all of those things by choice, not necessity."
There's a difference between being poor and living simply. Richard walked to my window, staring out at the quiet street where my neighbors were beginning their Saturday morning routines. Mrs. Chen was watering her garden across the street, and I could see Pastor Williams walking his elderly dog toward the small park at the end of the block. "Why?" Richard asked without turning around. "Why live like this if you don't have to?" It was the same question Victoria had asked, but coming from Richard, it carried different weight. He was a businessman who understood wealth accumulation, even if he didn't understand wealth preservation. His confusion was genuine rather than accusatory. Because I learned something about money that took me a long time to understand, I replied. Having it changes how people see you, how they treat you, what they expect from you. I wanted relationships based on who I am, not what I own. He turned back to face me, and I could see him reassessing everything he thought he knew about our family dynamics. But you let us think, Victoria's been worried about you, about your future security. Has she? I asked mildly. Or has she been embarrassed by what she assumed was my poverty? Richard's silence was answer enough. We both knew that Victoria's concern had been more about social perception than genuine worry for my well-being. The Sterling family had been managing what they saw as the embarrassing reality of Marcus's poor mother, not celebrating the loving relationship between a son and his parent. This changes things, Richard said finally. Yes, it does. He sat down heavily on my small sofa, suddenly looking older than his 58 years. Eleanor, I think there may have been some misunderstandings about intentions and attitudes. Victoria is young. Sometimes she speaks without thinking through the implications of her words. I recognized the beginning of a damage control conversation, the kind of careful diplomacy that successful businessmen use when they realize they've misjudged a situation badly. Richard was trying to minimize the significance of what had happened while positioning his family for whatever came next. Richard, let me be very clear about something, I said, my voice taking on a harder edge. Yesterday evening, your daughter called me a welfare queen living off government handouts. She said it was embarrassing how I parade around pretending to belong with decent, hardworking people. My own son agreed with her assessment. Richard winced at the blunt recitation of Victoria's words. She was upset, emotional. People say things they don't mean when they're frustrated. People reveal who they really are when they're emotional, I corrected. The masks come off and you see what someone truly thinks about you. The silence stretched between us while Richard processed the implications of what I was saying. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or wounded pride. This was about fundamental assumptions and judgments that had shaped how his family treated me for years. What can we do to make this right? He asked finally. It was exactly the question I had expected, and it revealed everything about how Richard approached problems. In his world, most conflicts could be resolved through negotiation, compromise, or financial arrangements. He was already thinking about what it would cost to repair the damage his daughter had caused. Richard, let me be very clear about something, I said, my voice taking on a harder edge. Yesterday evening, your daughter called me a welfare queen living off government handouts. She said it was embarrassing how I parade around pretending to belong with decent, hardworking people. My own son agreed with her assessment. Richard winced at the blunt recitation of Victoria's words. She was upset, emotional. People say things they don't mean when they're frustrated. People reveal who they really are when they're emotional, I corrected. The masks come off and you see what someone truly thinks about you. The silence stretched between us while Richard processed the implications of what I was saying. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or wounded pride. This was about fundamental assumptions and judgments that had shaped how his family treated me for years. What can we do to make this right? He asked finally. It was exactly the question I had expected, and it revealed everything about how Richard approached problems. In his world, most conflicts could be resolved through negotiation, compromise, or financial arrangements. He was already thinking about what it would cost to repair the damage his daughter had caused. Richard, I'm not sure anything can make this right. Some words can't be taken back. Some attitudes can't be undone. He leaned forward, his businessman instincts taking over despite the personal nature of our conversation. Eleanor, we're family. Surely we can find a way to move past this misunderstanding. Are we family? Because for 3 years, your daughter has treated me like an embarrassing charity case she was forced to tolerate. She's been planning my future without consulting me, Making suggestions about where I should live and how I should manage my finances? Richard's face tightened. Victoria mentioned some concerns about your living situation, but that was coming from a place of caring. I walked to my desk and retrieved a folder I had prepared that morning. Inside were printouts of text messages between Victoria and Marcus. Conversations I had discovered through methods that would have shocked them both. My late husband's nephew worked in telecommunications, and he had taught me more about digital privacy than most people my age understood. These are text messages between your daughter and my son from the past 6 months, I said, handing him the folder. I think you'll find them illuminating. Richard opened the folder reluctantly, and I watched his expression change as he read the exchanges between Victoria and Marcus. The messages revealed a systematic campaign to convince my son that I was becoming mentally incompetent, that my financial decisions were evidence of declining cognitive ability, and that intervention was necessary to protect me from myself. One message from Victoria was particularly damning. Your mom is definitely losing it. The way she insists on staying in that dump when she could get into a nice assisted living place is proof that she can't make rational decisions anymore. We need to start documenting this stuff in case we need to petition for guardianship. Marcus's response was equally troubling. I know you're right, but it's hard to think of Mom as incompetent. She raised me by herself and always seemed so capable. Victoria's reply showed the patience of someone working a long-term strategy. That's exactly why this is so hard to watch, but cognitive decline happens to everyone eventually. The sooner we accept that and take action, the better we can protect her from making decisions that could hurt her. Richard's hands were shaking slightly as he read through the messages. Each exchange revealed more of the coordinated effort to undermine my autonomy and establish grounds for legal intervention in my affairs. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent, I said quietly. Your daughter was documenting every conversation, every decision, every aspect of my life that she could characterize as evidence of declining capacity. Richard set the folder down carefully, as if it contained something dangerous. Eleanor, I had no idea. Victoria never mentioned anything about guardianship or competency issues. But she did mention her concerns about my mental state, didn't she? She shared her observations about my supposedly irrational attachment to this house, my poor financial decisions, my isolation from family. His silence confirmed what I already knew. Victoria had been laying groundwork with her parents as well as with Marcus, building a consensus that I was becoming a problem that needed to be managed, rather than a person who deserved respect. The irony is beautiful, I continued. While your daughter was planning to take control of my finances because she thought I was incompetent to manage them, I was earning more in monthly dividends than your furniture stores generate in quarterly profits. The comparison hit home. Richard's business was successful by small-town standards, but it was nothing compared to the wealth that Meridian Oil dividends represented. The woman they had been pitying was actually in a completely different financial category than any of them. What happens now? Richard asked, and I could hear genuine worry in his voice for the first time since he had arrived. It was the same question Marcus had asked the night before, and it revealed the fundamental shift that had occurred in our family dynamics. Instead of them making decisions about my future, I was now in the position to make decisions about theirs. That depends on several factors, I replied, starting with whether your family is capable of acknowledging the damage that's been done and taking genuine responsibility for it. Richard straightened in his chair, his business training asserting itself. What would that look like, specifically? I had spent most of the night thinking exactly about that question. The revelation of my wealth had given me power I had never possessed before, but it had also created responsibilities I wasn't sure I wanted. How do you rebuild relationships that have been poisoned by years of false assumptions and manipulative behavior? Complete honesty for starters, I said. No more managing my image or controlling information about my circumstances. If we're going to be family, it needs to be based on truth rather than convenient fictions. He nodded carefully. That seems reasonable. Public acknowledgement of what was said and done. Victoria humiliated me in front of my friends and neighbors. If she wants to repair the relationship, she needs to take responsibility for that in the same public forum.
Richard's expression tightened. Public apologies were difficult for people accustomed to maintaining carefully controlled images, but I wasn't interested in private reconciliations that would allow everyone to pretend nothing significant had happened. "And Marcus?" Richard asked. "Marcus needs to decide whether he's his wife's husband or his mother's son. He can't be both if Victoria continues to see me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected." The ultimatum was harsher than I had originally intended, but watching Richard's reaction convinced me it was necessary. Some situations couldn't be resolved through compromise or diplomatic solutions. Either Marcus would choose to defend his mother's dignity, or he would continue to enable his wife's manipulative behavior. "Eleanor, you're asking them to choose between their marriage and their relationship with you," Richard said carefully. "I'm asking them to choose between manipulation and honesty, between control and respect. If their marriage can't survive those choices, then perhaps it wasn't as strong as they believed." Richard stood up and walked back to the window, staring out at the quiet neighborhood where I had built a life based on authentic relationships. When he turned back to face me, his expression was resigned. "You know that Victoria's pride won't let her make a public apology easily."
She's never been good at admitting mistakes, especially in front of people she doesn't consider her social equals. "Then she'll need to learn," I replied simply. "Pride is a luxury she can no longer afford." The conversation continued for another hour, with Richard trying various approaches to find a compromise that would satisfy everyone involved. He offered private apologies, family meetings, even financial arrangements that might smooth over the hurt feelings. But I remained firm in my requirements. The damage had been public and deliberate, and the repair needed to match the scope of the offense. When Richard finally left, I could see him calculating possibilities and strategies in his mind. He was a problem solver by nature, accustomed to finding ways to make deals work even when the initial positions seemed incompatible. But this wasn't a business negotiation where everyone was motivated by mutual benefit. This was about family relationships, personal integrity, and the kind of respect that couldn't be purchased or negotiated. That afternoon brought a phone call from Marcus. His voice was strained, filled with the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting battles on multiple fronts. "Mom, I talked to Victoria about what happened last night. She's really upset about the misunderstanding." "What misunderstanding would that be, Marcus?" "About your financial situation. She feels terrible about the things she said, but she thought she was looking out for your best interests." I recognized Victoria's hand in the careful phrasing of Marcus's explanation. She was already working to reframe the confrontation as a well-intentioned mistake rather than a deliberate attack based on prejudice and arrogance. "Marcus, did you read the text messages I showed your father-in-law this morning?" There was a long pause. "He mentioned that you had some conversations between Victoria and me." "Mom, those were private discussions between a husband and wife who were concerned about a family member. Those were plans to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could take control of my finances and living arrangements. That's not concern, Marcus. That's manipulation. We were trying to protect you from making decisions that might hurt you in the long run. You were living in that small house, driving an old car, refusing help when we knew you were struggling. I wasn't struggling, Marcus. I was choosing to live simply. There's a fundamental difference that you and Victoria never bothered to understand." The conversation revealed how completely Marcus had adopted Victoria's perspective on my circumstances and mental capacity. In his mind, my choices were evidence of confusion or denial rather than deliberate lifestyle decisions made by a competent adult. "Marcus, can we just start over? Now that we understand your real situation, everything can be different." "Different how, Marcus? Are you going to treat me with respect because you've discovered I'm wealthy? Does my value as your mother depend on my bank account balance?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean? Because for 3 years, you've been treating me like a burden who needed management rather than your mother who deserved respect. The only thing that's changed is your knowledge of my financial status. Marcus was quiet for a long time, and I could almost hear him struggling with concepts that challenged everything he had convinced himself about our relationship. Finally, he spoke in a voice that sounded younger than his 34 years. "I don't know how to fix this, Mom. Victoria is my wife, but you're my mother. I love you both, and I don't want to lose either of you." "Then you need to decide what kind of man you want to be, Marcus. The kind who stands up for what's right, or the kind who goes along with whatever is convenient." After I hung up, I sat in my quiet living room thinking about the conversations that had filled my day. Richard's visit had confirmed what I already suspected. The Sterling family was primarily concerned with damage control rather than genuine accountability. Marcus's call had revealed that my son was still more interested in finding easy solutions than confronting difficult truths. The revelation of my wealth had shifted the power dynamics in ways that none of them had anticipated, but it hadn't changed the fundamental character issues that had created this crisis in the first place. Victoria was still the same person who had looked down on perceived poverty with contempt. Marcus was still the same man who had chosen convenience over courage when faced with difficult family dynamics. Money gave me the power to demand better treatment, but it couldn't give me the family relationships I had always wanted. Those would have to be earned through the much harder currency of honesty, respect, and genuine change. Whether any of them were capable of paying that price remained to be seen. As evening approached, I realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions. The comfortable anonymity I had maintained in Millbrook was gone forever, and with it the simple life I had built for 15 years. The question now was whether the truth that had been revealed would ultimately strengthen my family relationships or destroy them completely.
Looking at the oil stock certificate still spread across my coffee table, I understood that wealth was both a blessing and a burden. It had given me security and independence, but it had also created a barrier between me and the authentic human connections I valued most. Now that the secret was out, I would have to learn how to be rich in public while still maintaining the relationships that made life meaningful. The next phase of this family drama would test whether money could buy the one thing it had never been able to purchase: genuine love and respect from the people who mattered most. Based on the conversations I had already had, I wasn't optimistic about the outcome. But I was determined to find out whether my son and his wife were capable of growth, or whether some relationships were simply too damaged by assumptions and prejudice to survive the truth. 3 weeks later, I received a formal letter delivered by certified mail. The return address showed the law offices of Morrison, Williams and Associates in Austin, and I knew before opening it that Victoria had escalated the situation beyond family conversations and diplomatic negotiations. The letter was professionally written, but unmistakably hostile. Victoria's attorneys were requesting documentation of my mental capacity evaluations, financial competency assessments, and medical records dating back 5 years. They were also demanding proof of the legitimacy of my oil stock holdings and the source of funds used to acquire them. The legal strategy was transparent and predictable. Unable to convince me to quietly accept their version of reconciliation, Victoria was attempting to use the court system to achieve what manipulation had failed to accomplish. If she couldn't control me through family pressure, she would try to have me declared legally incompetent to manage my own affairs. I called my attorney in Dallas that afternoon. Patricia Chin had been handling my legal affairs for over a decade, and while she specialized in estate planning and business law rather than family conflicts, she understood wealth preservation better than most attorneys in Texas. "Eleanor, this is concerning," Patricia said after I read her the letter over the phone. "They're essentially threatening to pursue guardianship proceedings if you don't submit to their demands for financial documentation." "Can they do that?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Anyone can file a petition alleging mental incompetence, but they would need substantial evidence to convince a judge that intervention is necessary. The problem is that wealth hidden from family members can be characterized as erratic behavior, especially if they can demonstrate a pattern of secrecy and isolation. I felt a chill of recognition at Patricia's words. Victoria's months of documenting my lifestyle choices and Marcus's expressions of concern about my living situation suddenly made more sense. They hadn't just been building a case for family intervention. They had been creating a legal foundation for court action. "What would you recommend?" I asked. "We need to get ahead of this immediately. I want to arrange comprehensive evaluations by the most respected psychiatric and neurological specialists in the state. We'll document your complete mental competency in ways that will be impossible for any court to question." The evaluations took place over the following week at medical facilities in Dallas and Houston. I underwent cognitive testing, neurological examinations, psychiatric interviews, and financial competency assessments that were more thorough than anything I had experienced in my lifetime. Dr. Margaret Foster, the neuropsychologist who conducted the primary evaluation, was a stern woman in her 60s who had spent decades assessing mental capacity for legal proceedings. She put me through hours of testing that examined everything from basic arithmetic to complex problem solving and memory retention. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said at the conclusion of our final session, "I want to be very clear about something. Your cognitive function is not only normal for your age, it's superior to most people 20 years younger. Your financial knowledge and investment acumen demonstrate sophisticated understanding of complex economic concepts. Any suggestion that you lack the mental capacity to manage your own affairs would be medically unsupportable." Dr. Foster's written report was even more definitive. She specifically addressed the lifestyle choices that Victoria had characterized as evidence of declining capacity, explaining that voluntary simplicity and privacy preferences were personality traits rather than symptoms of cognitive impairment. Armed with the medical documentation, Patricia and I developed a comprehensive legal strategy that would protect my interests while sending a clear message about the consequences of pursuing frivolous guardianship proceedings. The first step was a formal response to Victoria's attorney, delivered with copies of all medical evaluations and a detailed financial statement prepared by my certified public accountant. The documentation showed not only my current net worth, which had grown to over $16 million, but also the sophisticated investment strategy that had generated that wealth over 4 decades. The second step was more aggressive. Patricia filed a motion for sanctions against Victoria's legal team, arguing that their guardianship threat constituted harassment of an elderly person without legal foundation. We also initiated a civil claim for defamation based on Victoria's public statements about my mental capacity and financial dependence. The third step was the most significant. I instructed Patricia to prepare a new will that would dramatically alter the inheritance expectations of everyone involved in this conflict. Under my original estate plan, Marcus would have inherited the bulk of my assets, with smaller bequests to various charities and friends. The new will redistributed everything. Marcus's inheritance was reduced to a nominal amount, with the majority of my estate directed to educational scholarships for students from low-income families in East Texas. The irony was deliberate and pointed. The oil wealth that Victoria had tried to claim through legal manipulation would ultimately benefit exactly the kind of students she had always looked down upon: young people from modest backgrounds who needed financial assistance to pursue higher education. Patricia included a letter with the new will that would be read to all potential beneficiaries after my death. The letter explained in detail the events that had led to my decision, including Victoria's public humiliation of me and the coordinated family effort to have me declared mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. "This isn't just about revenge," I explained to Patricia as we finalized the documents. "It's about ensuring that my wealth ultimately serves a purpose that aligns with my values, rather than enabling the kind of behavior that created this situation." The legal maneuvering had an immediate impact on family dynamics. Within days of receiving our response, Victoria's attorney withdrew the guardianship threat and requested a meeting to discuss mutually acceptable resolutions to outstanding family concerns.
Richard Sterling called me personally to arrange a face-to-face conversation at a neutral location. We met at a coffee shop in Tyler, halfway between our respective homes, where he arrived looking older and more tired than he had during his visit to my house. "Eleanor, this has gone too far," he said without preamble. "Victoria was wrong to threaten legal action, and we're prepared to acknowledge that publicly." "Are you?" I asked, studying his face for signs of genuine remorse versus strategic positioning. "We're prepared to make a public statement acknowledging that Victoria's comments at your birthday party were inappropriate and hurtful. We're also prepared to make a financial gesture to demonstrate our sincerity." The offer of money revealed how completely Richard misunderstood the nature of our conflict. He was still thinking in terms of business transactions, assuming that financial compensation could resolve what was fundamentally a matter of respect and dignity. "Richard, this isn't about money. Your family has 16 million reasons to treat me with respect now, but that's not the kind of respect I wanted or needed." "Then what do you want?" he asked, his frustration evident. "I want you to understand that the person you've been dismissing and planning to control has been more successful in business than you could ever hope to be. I want Victoria to acknowledge that her assumptions about poverty and welfare recipients were based on ignorance and prejudice. And I want Marcus to decide whether he's going to be the man his father and I tried to raise, or whether he's going to continue being his wife's enabler." Richard was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of what I was saying. Finally, he spoke in a voice that carried genuine regret for the first time since this conflict began. "We misjudged you badly, Eleanor, all of us, and we treated you in ways that were unacceptable regardless of your financial circumstances." "Yes, you did. Victoria wants to apologize personally. She's prepared to do it publicly if that's what it takes to repair this relationship." I considered his offer carefully. Public apologies could be meaningful if they came from genuine remorse, but they could also be empty gestures designed to minimize damage rather than acknowledge wrongdoing. "What about Marcus?" I asked. Richard's expression darkened slightly. "Marcus is struggling with this situation. He's caught between loyalty to his wife and his relationship with you." "He's caught between right and wrong, Richard. The fact that he sees it as a loyalty conflict tells me everything I need to know about his character." 3 days later, Victoria called me directly. Her voice was different from any previous conversation we had shared, stripped of the confident condescension that had characterized her attitude toward me for 3 years. "Eleanor, I owe you an apology that's long overdue." "Yes, you do. I was wrong about everything. Your circumstances, your capabilities, your value as a person and as Marcus's mother. I said things that were cruel and inexcusable, and I influenced Marcus to see you in ways that were unfair and hurtful." The words seemed genuine, but I had learned to be skeptical of Victoria's motivations. "What changed your mind, Victoria? The discovery that I'm wealthy, or some deeper realization about how you've been treating people?" There was a long pause before she answered. "Both, if I'm being honest. Learning about your financial success made me realize how completely wrong I was about your capabilities. But it also made me think about how I've been treating other people I assumed were beneath me somehow." "Other people like who?" "Service workers, people I thought were living on government assistance, anyone whose lifestyle I didn't understand or approve of. I've been using your situation to examine my own attitudes, and I don't like what I've discovered about myself." For the first time in our relationship, Victoria sounded like she was engaging in genuine self-reflection rather than strategic positioning. The humility in her voice was either authentic remorse or an exceptionally skilled performance. "Victoria, understanding your own prejudices is a good start, but it doesn't undo the damage that's been done.
You spent months planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. You documented my conversations and living choices as evidence of declining capacity. You turned my own son against me by convincing him that I needed to be managed rather than respected. I know, she said quietly. I know how terrible that sounds, and I know that apologizing doesn't fix it. But I want you to know that I understand the magnitude of what I did wrong. What about Marcus? I asked.
Marcus is having a harder time with this than I am. He's always seen himself as a good son, and discovering that he was being manipulated into treating you badly has shaken his confidence in his own judgment. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Victoria providing more details about the family dynamics that had led to this crisis. She admitted that her parents had been pressuring her to distance Marcus from what they saw as his embarrassing family background. She acknowledged that the guardianship plan had been her idea, born from a combination of social embarrassment and genuine belief that she understood my situation better than I did. Most importantly, she committed to making a public statement at the next Millbrook Community Center gathering, acknowledging her mistakes and taking full responsibility for the conflict that had divided our family. The public apology took place 3 weeks later at the monthly community dinner that Helen organized for neighborhood residents. Victoria arrived wearing simple clothes rather than her usual designer outfits, and she stood before the same group of people who had witnessed her attack on me at my birthday party. I owe Eleanor Whitmore and this community an apology, she began, her voice steady despite obvious nervousness. Last month, I made statements about Eleanor that were cruel, false, and based on assumptions that revealed my own ignorance and prejudice. She went on to acknowledge that her comments about welfare recipients and government assistance had been inappropriate regardless of their accuracy, and that her attitude toward people experiencing financial difficulties reflected badly on her character and upbringing. I also want everyone to know that Eleanor's financial circumstances are completely different from what I assumed them to be. She is a successful investor and businesswoman who chose to live simply rather than ostentatiously. My failure to understand that choice led me to treat her with disrespect that she never deserved. The apology was more comprehensive and more genuine than I had expected. Victoria took full responsibility for her actions without making excuses or shifting blame to others. She specifically addressed the broader implications of her attitudes toward economic inequality and social status. When she finished speaking, the community center was completely quiet. Then Pastor Williams began to applaud, followed by Helen and Mrs. Chen, and eventually the entire gathering. The applause wasn't just for Victoria's courage in making a public apology. It was recognition that genuine accountability was rare and valuable. After the dinner, Victoria approached me privately. Eleanor, I know that apologizing doesn't automatically repair our relationship. I'm hoping we can start over with honesty and mutual respect. Starting over would require Marcus to make some decisions about what kind of man he wants to be. Have you talked to him about that? Victoria's expression grew sad. He's been struggling with this whole situation. He feels guilty about how he treated you, but he's also angry that you kept your financial success secret for so long. He thinks you manipulated the situation by letting us make wrong assumptions. The accusation stung because it contained an element of truth. I had deliberately maintained a facade that encouraged certain assumptions about my circumstances. The question was whether that deception justified the treatment I had received, or whether it simply revealed character traits that would have manifested regardless of my actual financial status. Victoria, would you and Marcus have treated me differently if you had known about my wealth from the beginning? She considered the question carefully before answering. Probably. We would have been more deferential, more interested in maintaining a good relationship. We might not have been as genuine in our interactions with you. Exactly. The person you've been apologizing to tonight is the same person you called a welfare queen 3 weeks ago. The only thing that changed was your knowledge of my bank account balance.
If that's what it takes to earn respect from my own family, then perhaps we don't have the kind of relationship worth preserving. Marcus finally came to see me a week after Victoria's public apology. He arrived alone, without the defensive posturing that had characterized our previous conversations since my revelation. He looked tired and uncertain, like someone who had been forced to question fundamental assumptions about himself and his relationships. "Marcus, I don't know how to fix this," he said as soon as I opened the door. "Come in, Marcus. Let's talk." We sat in my small living room, the same space where so many difficult conversations had taken place over the past month. Marcus looked around with new eyes, seeing the deliberate simplicity I had chosen rather than the poverty he had assumed. "He's been thinking about everything that's happened," he said slowly. "About the way Victoria and I treated you, about the assumptions we made, about the guardianship plan that I thought was for your own good." "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That I failed you as a son, that I let someone else's judgment override my own knowledge of who you are and what you're capable of, that I was so focused on what I thought you needed that I never asked what you actually wanted." The admission was painful to hear because it was completely accurate. Marcus had allowed Victoria to reshape his understanding of our relationship, turning him from a loving son into a concerned manager who believed he knew what was best for me better than I did. "Marcus, the hardest part of this whole situation hasn't been the money or the legal threats or even the public humiliation. It's been watching you transform from the man your father and I raised into someone who could plan to take away my autonomy because his wife convinced him it was necessary." "I know," he said quietly. "I know how terrible that sounds." But at the time, it felt like love. It felt like protection. It was control disguised as care, Marcus. And the fact that you couldn't see the difference tells me that Victoria's influence over you runs deeper than I realized. We talked for hours that afternoon, examining the patterns that had led to our family crisis and the choices that each of us had made along the way. Marcus acknowledged that his marriage had been built partly on shared assumptions about social status and financial success that had blinded him to other values. He also admitted that discovering my wealth had forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about success, achievement, and family relationships. The mother he had been pitying was actually more financially successful than he could ever hope to be, which challenged his understanding of his own accomplishments and prospects. "What happens now?" he asked as our conversation wound down. "That depends on what kind of relationship you want to have with me going forward," I replied. "If you want to continue being Victoria's husband, who occasionally visits his wealthy mother out of duty, then we can maintain polite contact and nothing more. And if I want something different, then you need to decide what you value more, your wife's approval or your mother's respect. Because based on everything that's happened, I don't think you can have both." The ultimatum was harsh, but necessary. Some conflicts couldn't be resolved through compromise or diplomatic solutions. Either Marcus would choose to rebuild our relationship based on honesty and mutual respect, or he would continue to prioritize his marriage over his family relationships. 6 months later, I received a phone call that changed everything once again. Marcus was calling to tell me that Victoria was pregnant and that they wanted me to be involved in their child's life as a grandmother. The news filled me with conflicting emotions. Part of me was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a grandmother, of having the opportunity to build a relationship with a new generation that wouldn't be tainted by past assumptions and conflicts. But another part of me worried that this was simply another attempt to access my wealth, this time using an unborn child as leverage. "Mom, we want to do this right," Marcus said during that phone call. "We want our child to know their grandmother, not just the wealthy investor, but the woman who raised me and built something remarkable through hard work and patience." "What does Victoria think about that?" I asked. "Victoria has been doing a lot of soul searching since her public apology.
She's been reading about wealth inequality and social justice, trying to understand how her privileged background shaped her attitudes toward people in different economic circumstances. The changes Marcus described sounded promising, but I had learned to be cautious about accepting transformation claims at face value. Real change took time to demonstrate, and pregnancy often motivated temporary behavior modifications that didn't necessarily reflect permanent shifts in character. I want to be part of my grandchild's life, I told Marcus, but not as a convenient source of financial support or social status. If I'm going to be a grandmother, it needs to be because you value me as a person, not because you value my bank account. I understand. And I want you to know that Victoria and I have been talking about raising our child with an understanding of money and privilege that we didn't have when we were growing up. The conversation marked the beginning of a careful reconciliation process that would take years to complete. Victoria's pregnancy motivated both her and Marcus to examine their values more seriously, particularly regarding the kind of example they wanted to set for their child. Over the following months, our family relationships slowly began to heal. Victoria made genuine efforts to understand the perspectives of people from different economic backgrounds, and she used her experience with me as a starting point for broader social awareness. Marcus gradually rebuilt trust by consistently choosing honesty over convenience, even when it meant disagreeing with Victoria or acknowledging his own mistakes. He also began to appreciate the discipline and patience that had enabled me to build wealth over decades, rather than expecting immediate gratification. When my granddaughter Emma was born, I held her in the same community center where Victoria had humiliated me nearly a year earlier. The room was filled with neighbors and friends who had supported me through the family crisis, and Victoria publicly thanked them for their patience and forgiveness during her period of learning and growth. Looking at Emma's innocent face, I realized that wealth had given me many things over the years: security, independence, and ultimately the power to demand respect from people who had dismissed me. But the most valuable gift it had provided was the opportunity to test relationships under pressure and discover which ones were strong enough to survive the truth. The oil dividends continued to arrive each month, now deposited into accounts that my family knew about and understood. But the money itself had become less important than the lessons it had taught all of us about character, assumptions, and the difference between earned respect and purchased deference. As I watched Emma sleep in her mother's arms, surrounded by family members who had learned to value authenticity over appearances, I knew that my granddaughter Emma would grow up understanding that true wealth came not from what you owned, but how you treated the people around you, regardless of their circumstances. The quiet life I had built in Millbrook would never be the same, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Sometimes the truth, no matter how disruptive, created space for relationships that were stronger and more genuine than anything that could be built on convenient assumptions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.